You ready? Welcome. We're delighted to have you come out tonight. This is the beginning of our spring series of the Arts and Humanities program, hosted by the Foundation of Wayne Community College. We are very happy to have Graeme Robertson back here again. He was here a year ago when things were going on in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, and he's going to update us on what's been happening over the year, and he actually spent quite a bit of time there, but I'll let him tell you that. I did want to, of course it's a little dark in there, recognize the fact that our president, Patty Pfeiffer, of Wayne Community College is here tonight. And to introduce Graeme, Max Orr came down with him from Carolina Public Humanities. Now, we have had a long-standing partnership, friendship with Carolina Public Humanities for years. And they have been steadfast bringing speakers in each of our series. And this, in this series, they're actually bringing two. Graeme came because we wanted to talk about Ukraine, and we also wanted to talk about China. So on March the 18th, note in your brochure that Angel Xu is coming to talk about China and U.S.-Chinese relations over climate change. So that should be very interesting. Don't miss next week, March 4th, because we are going to have Terry Williams. She's a conservator at East Carolina University in the lab that is conserving the artifacts that they're bringing up from Queen Anne's Revenge. And while we've known that's been a story for a long time, she can tell us quite a bit about that. We've still got a few more coming in, which is wonderful. But I'm going to turn it over to Max, and again, we thank him and Carolina Public Humanities so much. And Graeme, we thank you so much for coming again.
Thank you, Charlotte, and welcome everybody. It's such a wonderful pleasure to be out here in Goldsboro again at Wayne Community College. Charlotte had mentioned that Carolina Public Humanities has a long relationship with this fine institution, and it's so true. We've been coming here. Matter of fact, I was just on this stage last fall talking about the Barbary Pirates. You're going to have something a little bit more timely today, I think. So I want to thank Charlotte Brown. I want to thank the foundation at Wayne Community College also for again, having this commitment to the humanities and to dialogic conversations. This is what Carolina Public Humanities is all about, making sure that scholarship is shared with the public and also that the public have opportunities to ask some questions. I'm going to introduce Graeme in just a moment. I just want to also mention that our relationship with Wayne County in general is so special because of our relationship with the Wayne County Friends of Public Education, Phil and Margaret Bedore, Adrian Northington, Kay Cook, and so many others who have been instrumental in helping us support our K-12 program. So again, it's a real pleasure to be out here at this particular institution. There are, I believe, 58 community colleges in North Carolina, and only about 3 or 4 of them are we consider our flagship partners, and Wayne Community College is at the top of that list. So certainly want to thank all those folks. Charlotte, we mentioned, of course, welcome the President as well for being here today, again, showing that commitment to the public aspect of education. And Stephen Smith, making sure that everybody can hear, they don't need to hear my voice, but they'll be able to hear Graeme's voice and see these things. So thank you, Stephen, for your work back there. Graeme Robertson I've known for several years now. In fact, the first time I met Graeme was by asking him to come and give a talk. It seems to be the way I meet a lot of people. Graeme Robertson is professor of political science and director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies. And he and I just had a conversation that the worst thing you can do is just read someone's CV when you're about to introduce them. So I will not do that, Graeme. I will just say that he is a professor of political science he studied at Oxford, did his master's at Harvard, and received his PhD from Columbia. He's the author with Samuel A. Green at Putin versus the People, and the author of other wonderful books, which you can go to the UNC website and read his whole CV if you would like, and then get involved. But the most important thing I want to say about Graeme Robertson is his commitment to public service and his commitment to the public aspect. It's way too easy to be a professor at a Research One university and spend your time in the rarefied world of scholarship. And there is such a hunger in the public, you're a testament to it here being today, to understand from experts what is going on in the world, and that is something in a public university that is not just perfunctory, but it's central to our mission. And Graeme has lived that. He's always been incredibly generous with Carolina Public Humanities, and of course with people throughout the state of North Carolina. So that's not your CV, Graeme, but that's the most important thing about you, and let's turn it over to Graeme Robertson.
So thank you so much, Charlotte, for inviting me down here, and to Charlotte and Max for the very kind and generous introduction. I give a lot of talks on this subject. I give a lot of talks on Ukraine and Russia around the state and in other parts of the country, but very few people ever invite me back. So thank you for that. That makes Wayne County even more special in my heart than it would be otherwise. So that's very kind of you. It's so great to see so many people out here tonight. This is a subject that is very, very dear to my heart and has motivated me a lot over the last really decade or so. And I'll talk about why I say a decade in a minute. And it's also something that tends to fall a little bit out of the news because of other events in the world and simply because the full-scale war has been going on for 2 years. So I'm really gratified to see so many people here tonight, and for each and every one of you who's still interested and still cares about Ukraine and still understands how Ukraine's fate hangs in the balance. I'm very grateful to you for that. I'm going to talk about the current situation. I'm going to talk about the situation in the war. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Ukrainian society has changed over the last decade and where Ukraine is going in terms of the world. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we can do as citizens to play our part in helping Ukraine and helping push back Putin and Russian aggression. I'm looking forward to the questions and very much open to that. So I will try not to talk for too long, but then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. When I start these presentations, I always start with a map because the map is really the key to understanding this whole dynamic. And so this is a map of contemporary Ukraine. This is it over here. Russia is up there. And as you see, occupies this very long border with Ukraine. And then to Ukraine's north is Belarus, which is a Russian ally. A state that depends almost entirely 100% on Russia and is host to Russian troops. And so Ukraine is sort of surrounded on three sides, really, by Russia. But on every other side of Ukraine, and this is another reason why it's incredibly important for all of us, is all these countries in blue. The Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, that's Slovakia there, Romania, Hungary. These are all NATO allies of the United States. The United States is committed to defend these countries' borders, and an attack on any one of those will be treated as an attack on the United States itself. So we're one border away from war with Russia. And if you remember nothing else from tonight, please remember that if Ukraine falls under Russian control, then Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Hungary one of them could be next. And if one of them is next, then that's an attack on the United States. And so this war is a war for Ukraine's security. It's a war of survival for Ukraine. It's a war of really about Ukraine's existence as an independent actor on the world stage. But it's also a war for our own security. And the bravery and courage that the Ukrainians show every day is bravery and courage fought in a cause that's our cause too. And I think that's the single most important sort of fact to understand and grasp about Ukraine. Another interesting aspect of this is this body of water down here, the Black Sea, in southern Ukraine. This is where Ukraine has access through the Mediterranean and into the rest of the world. And so an enormous part of Ukraine's trade passes through the Black Sea. An enormous part of the world's food production passes through the Black Sea. And blocking off Ukraine's contribution in terms of sunflower oil, Ukraine makes about 70% of the world's sunflower oil, in terms of wheat, and a whole range of different agricultural products that countries in Africa and around Latin America and other places depend on for their economy and their food supply. That is also another issue that makes Ukraine's security and its ability to continue to use those Black Sea ports absolutely critical for the globe. So this is a conflict that extends well beyond the borders of Ukraine itself. Russian military aggression, I said a few minutes ago, Russian military aggression started 10 years ago. So in 2014, there was a revolution in Ukraine. And Ukraine overthrew a Moscow-supported president, a president who really was a gangster, and I don't use that word figuratively, I mean literally a gangster. He'd served time in prison. He was a mafia boss in eastern Ukraine. He became president of Ukraine in 2012, and he tried to kind of navigate a middle path between Russia and Europe. He was presiding over a country that was divided between those primarily in the east and south of the country who wanted close relations with Russia, who had a lot of family relations in Russia. Many of them are Russian speakers. A significant number of them are actually ethnically Russian too. They wanted to maintain close relations with Russia, whereas the western part of the country was very much oriented towards a European future, much more oriented towards joining the EU. And this president was trying to kind of balance between the two. Then in 2013, in the fall, Putin came around with an ultimatum. And he said to the president of Ukraine, you are now going to tell the world that you renounce Ukraine's ambitions to join the EU, to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU. And instead, you're going to join a Russian economic organization called the Eurasian Economic Union. And he made that announcement, and this provoked street protests, and then over the course of several months, a rebellion that overthrew the Russian-backed president of Ukraine. In the aftermath of that, Russia moved very, very quickly. And they launched a war, first of all in Crimea, this peninsula down here, where there was, Russia had leased a port for its Black Sea fleet, and which was also home to the Ukrainian Navy. And as you can see from the map, is really important for control of the Black Sea and access to the Black Sea. So Russia seized that, and then they sponsored rebellions in the eastern part of Ukraine in a coal mining region of the country known as the Donbass, the Don Basin. And these parts of Ukraine came fairly quickly under Russian control and actually became integrated into the Russian political system. Ukraine tried to defend itself at first very poorly. It was not equipped to defend itself properly, but gradually over time they formed an army that was effective. They improved their training, and they really strengthened their armed forces, pushed the Russians back a little bit. But they were fighting on this border, have been fighting on this border since 2014, with about 12,000 casualties in that conflict. So a pretty intense fight that's been going on for a decade. That fight got a lot more intense in February of 2022. On February 24th of 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of the whole country with the idea of very quickly coming from the north, from Belarus, and surrounding Kyiv and taking the capital, with the idea that the government would fall in a matter of a few days, and they would then be replaced by some kind of Russian puppet regime. The attack came very, very, very close to success. This is a town called Irpin. This is a town called Bucha, which I visited. These are pictures that I took back in September when I was visiting the region. And you can see on this map, this is from my phone, getting directions on how to drive to these towns. With rush hour traffic in the morning, it was only 33 minutes to get there from the center of Kyiv. So that gives you some kind of sense of really how incredibly close to achieving their objective the Russians were. And goodness knows what would have happened if they had actually managed to seize Kyiv. Because what happened in these towns and other towns under Russian control was simply horrific. The Russians committed rape on a large scale. They shot civilians in the street. They tortured others. People hid in their homes, petrified. They burned buildings down. They destroyed monuments. They destroyed museums. They burned Ukrainian language books. They destroyed Ukrainian churches. They really made a huge effort to attack both the citizenry and the very sort of essence of Ukrainian identity and Ukrainianness in these places. And what's so important about what Russia did in those days is it made very, very clear, I think, that this was not just some kind of geopolitical game where they were trying to take some territory in order to, limit NATO's influence in Ukraine. No, this was much more than that. This was an attack on the very idea of Ukraine as a sovereign state, of Ukrainians as a people, and the clear desire behind it to wipe them out. In other words, genocide. So this is Bucha and Irpin, and the crimes that were committed there were repeated in many other places across Ukraine. They're being repeated right now in the Russian-occupied territories to the east and to the south of the country. So where does the military conflict stand now? Well, this map is basically shows you the to and fro of the conflict. In those first days, Russia conquered large parts of the east and the south, adding on to what it already held in Crimea, but it also conquered all this territory along the Russian border to the north and along the Belarusian border to the north and just outside of Kyiv. Kyiv's about here. This map, for some reason, doesn't have it on, but Kyiv is about there. And they captured the city of Kherson on the Dnieper River there and took a significant part of the south. So this does two things. One is it absolutely encircles the Ukrainian capital, right, which from a strategic perspective obviously is really problematic. They also cross this large river, this large waterway down here that's a significant barrier to taking the rest of the country. And they push, Odessa is about here, so they push almost towards the border and on the west of the country along that Black Sea coast. But that's as far as they got. As far as they got because the Ukrainian army, basically under the leadership of Zelensky, and I'm happy to talk more about Zelensky in a little bit, took very courageous decision to stand and fight and to use all of the resources, both in terms of the army, but also in terms of citizenry and informal units to fight and push them back and to stop the war there. And then with support from allies, with support from the United States, and massive support from the Europeans have put in at least as much money as the United States have. They were able in 2023 to push the Russians out. They pushed the Russians out of the north. They pushed the Russians out along there, and then they seized the land in the northern part of Kherson. This was the only, actually, Kherson was the only big city that the Russians took, and the Ukrainians were able to push them out into the suburbs of the city. So the Ukrainians made a lot of progress in that period in the fall of 2022. But since then, things have gotten kind of stuck in this area where Russia controls all this territory along here still, and Crimea, and still controls this. This is really a sort of industrial heartland, and some of the main ports that Ukraine had destroyed. Mariupol is a town you might have heard of, might ring a bell. It was completely wiped out during the first phase of the war, and there was a large steel plant there, the After steel plant, where fighting went on for months and months and months. It was really a siege, like a kind of World War II, I mean, a really barbaric siege that went on for months. And we actually had the great privilege to be able to hire an outreach coordinator from Mariupol last year, a woman that would have been trapped in Mariupol on the Russian side had she not been out of town at her kids' volleyball game the day the Russians came in. So this sort of gives you a sense of the kind of fragility of the situation and of the chance that war brings. So that's sort of where things got kind of stuck. And I'll talk a little bit more about recent activity along the front line. But essentially this image of Russia having taken this huge swath of the east and the south of Ukraine is essentially where we are today. But that's not the only thing that's been going on. So at the same time as the Russians have been fighting to dominate Ukraine for 10 years, Ukraine has been changing. And Ukraine has changed politically, it's changed culturally, and it's changed the nature of its society in really significant ways. So I want to talk about some of those things. In terms of politics, Ukraine has gone from being a country that was divided over its future in the world and into one that's very much united along what it sees as its future path. This is, I still haven't translated this from Ukrainian, but I will, one day I will. The blue lines are the percentage of the population that support joining NATO, right? And the red line is the percentage of the population that are against joining NATO. And what you see is, like, at the start of the invasion in 2014, a majority of Ukrainians actually were against joining NATO. There was some political discussion about it. The Ukrainian government, some of them wanted to join NATO, then their successors wouldn't, but the population was very mixed on it. Then after the invasion, you see a big kick up in the proportion of Ukrainians that want to join NATO, and it becomes a majority. But it stays sort of like just around between 40 and 50%, all the way up into the eve, really, of the current invasion. So that's December 2021, just a couple of months before the war. Then support for joining NATO starts to rise. And by the time you get to the eve of invasion, or just after the invasion, it's a very substantial majority, 76% of Ukrainians actually want to join NATO. This is really important for all sorts of reasons, but the key reason I think it's really important to bear this in mind is when you see or you hear Putin talk about NATO expanding and NATO, reflecting kind of Euro-Atlantic Western ambition to curtail Russia, these people want to join NATO. This is not the US saying, please join NATO. In fact, the French and the Germans have been saying, please don't join NATO for a really long time. The desire to join NATO, and all these other countries that we saw earlier on in the beginning, who are all in blue, all these NATO countries, they all wanted to join NATO too. They joined of their own volition. So from the Russian perspective, yes, it's true that NATO has expanded. NATO has come up to their borders, but that's because people were afraid of them, and they wanted security from NATO. So that's not NATO's fault, right? That's Russia's fault, not being able to find a better security solution for the region. The same is true about joining the European Union. These, again, are the blue line are people who say they would like Ukraine to join the EU, and the red line who's against, and we start again around the end of 13, beginning of 2014, and you see support start to rise above majority for joining the EU. It's a little higher, actually, than support for joining NATO. It's maybe about 10 points higher. But it stays around kind of half the population, and then about a third who don't want to join, and the rest don't really know. And then you see, again, as we move towards the invasion in 2022, a huge surge in support for joining the European Union, so joining Western institutions, taking a Western path, becoming a Western democracy and staying a Western democracy. Not just joining the European Union is not just an economic project. It's not just about free trade. It is about those things, but it's primarily a cultural project. It's primarily a civilizational project. It's a project about democracy. It's a project about the rule of law. And if you actually want to join the European Union, there's all sorts of requirements that you have to fulfill. There's books and books and books of requirements. There's a years-long process that you have to demonstrate that you have an independent judiciary, that independent judiciary works, that when you do public contracting, you do it fairly, you do it cleanly, you do it with transparency. It's a really big undertaking to join the European Union, and Ukrainians want that. They want to be part of that Western society. And of course, for Putin, this is unacceptable. Right? And Ukraine's drift towards joining these European institutions really is what made him decide, I think, to take action. Not because of the geopolitics of it, not because of the NATO thing itself, but more because he was afraid that Russia was going to lose Ukraine, and he wanted to break it before the West took it, essentially. This is a map that shows you kind of the probability of, this is from my own surveys. That I've been doing surveys in Ukraine since about 2012. And in this, what we try to do is we try to see how important a factor in wanting to join the EU was the part of Ukraine that you came from. I said earlier on that Ukraine historically had been divided between a pro-Western West and North and a much more pro-Russian South and East. And if you look at our numbers, so if you're from the South or East, you're in black or in purple. And you can see that which part of the country you came from was a big factor in deciding the likelihood of wanting to join the EU. So if you were from the west of Ukraine, about 80% of people wanted to join the European Union. But if you're from the south, it was about half of that, between 40 and 50% of people in those regions wanted to join the European Union. And what you see is those lines converge over time. And they don't converge in the middle, they converge at the top. So basically, Ukrainians from the west, from the center, from the south and the east of the country become much more Western-oriented than they were before. And this is really the product of 10 years of war with Russia. What Putin has done in attacking Ukraine and using violence against Ukraine is bring about the outcome that he didn't really want, right? His whole point is to try and keep Ukrainians away from these Western institutions, and all he's done by using aggression, by using violence, is push them towards it. There are still some differences. So this is the blue line represents support for joining the EU amongst people who speak Ukrainian at home, and then the red line is people who speak Russian at home. So there are still some differences. It's still true that Ukrainian speakers tend to be more Western-oriented than Russian speakers are. But what you see is the Russian speakers' numbers are going up and up and up over time. So it's not just about Westernized Ukrainian speakers. It's even people who speak Russian are moving in this direction of being much more Western-oriented. And in fact, that's one of the extraordinary things that President Zelensky has done. President Zelensky is a Russian speaker. When he started speaking Ukrainian, people made fun of him because his accent wasn't that great. He's an actor, so he got good at it quite quickly, but there was a delay. And what Zelensky has done is really, and this was even before the invasion, Zelensky has managed to create a new path in Ukrainian politics. Ukraine was really divided we're all familiar with red states and blue states, right? Ukraine had its own red state and blue state situation. That people in the west of the country and the north of the country voted for candidates who were Ukrainian speaking and who ran as sort of patriots of a country that was represented by West Ukrainian culture. And people from the east of Ukraine voted for candidates who promised better relations with Russia and who promised to protect their right to speak Russian, their right to educate their kids in Russian, and continue a kind of much more Russified way of life. And what Zelensky did, the brilliance of Zelensky was, and the reason the red states and blue states thing is really important, because you can imagine how hard it is if you think about what would it take in American politics to break that red state, blue state thing up. It just seems really challenging. If any of you think of something, please let us all know, right? But Zelensky came up with a way of breaking that up. And he ran as a patriotic Ukrainian who happened to be a Russian speaker and happened to be Jewish, but was just as proud of being Ukrainian as anybody else. And that created a whole different coalition for him. He won the election in a landslide. He created his own political party that won 75% of the seats in the parliamentary election. This was a very powerful political message because the old guys were left stuck with their old-fashioned message, and he had this new message of unity, of pride, and of hope, and he's also very funny, so he delivered it with a lot of skill and a lot of wit. And so when you see all these lines going up, even before the Russian invasion, what you're seeing is a combination of Russian pressure on the one hand and Zelensky's political genius on the other hand in creating these opportunities for Russian speakers to feel part of that westernized project. And that's really, I think, even before the war started, this was an indicator of what an amazing political operator Zelensky was to be. Let's see. So this is some data on approval for Zelensky and other different institutions in the country. And I want to show you this because I want to give you a sense of, during 2 years of war, how opinion has moved within the country itself. I'm going to show you some other pictures on this in a second. But so the top line is the President Zelensky, and the percentage of the population that said they trust him in December of 21, 22, and 23. And what you see is that he was in trouble in December of 2021 before the Russians came. He had been in office by that point for 2 years. The economy was, not doing very well. He had actually run on a platform of promising peace. He was going to negotiate with Putin and make a deal over Crimea and make a deal over the territories in the east. Putin was not serious about negotiations, so those negotiations never went anywhere. And he was losing a little bit of traction within the country. Still, 20% of only 27% of the population said that they fully trusted him, and then the rest were either against or unsure. Of course, his performance in the early days of the war, his popularity shoots up into the high 80s because he was quite simply a hero who risked his own life and the life of his family in order to defend his country. And he managed to basically take a step back from the everyday politics of fighting the war. His strategy very much was, I'm an executive. People say he's a comedian. He is actually a comedian, but he was also, before he became president, the CEO of the largest media corporation in Ukraine. So he was a businessman, much more than just a comedian, right? But not a soldier. And so he stood away from the soldiers and he said, okay, the soldiers, you fight the war. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the world and I'm going to raise money and I'm going to raise arms and donations, and I'm going to be the international face of this war. And I'm also going to make Ukrainians help boost their confidence and make them feel strong. And he did a great job of that. And so his popularity was really high. By the end of last year, though, his popularity starts to fade a little bit, in part because the war is stuck in this difficult situation. It's not really going anywhere. And he ends up getting more involved, and he's frustrated. Everybody's frustrated right? The arms that we're promising are not coming. We promise all sorts of weapons that do eventually get delivered sometimes, but typically are later, with the consequence that the big offensive that we were expecting last summer to take place didn't happen because the Ukrainians just simply didn't have the weaponry that they had been promised, and so they weren't able to use it. And so some of that starts to blow back on Zelensky. It's not blowing back, though, on his military commander, Zaluzhny, who starts to become a hero. So not long after I made these slides, they fired Zaluzhny and replaced him with somebody else who was less of a threat. But support for the Ukrainian armed forces, you see, remains incredibly high. 96% of people still trust the soldiers. So there's a kind of a mixed sense of the soldiers are doing a great job, but the political leadership is kind of struggling a little bit. And you see this in this institution. This is the parliament, the Verkhovna Rada. Only 15% of people say they trust their members of parliament. Now, that's probably higher than in the US at this point, but it's pretty bad. And only a quarter say they trust the government itself. So there's this clear moment now of a sense that that something needs to change in terms of the war. You see this also in terms of the attitudes towards fighting itself. Yeah. The vast majority of Ukrainians, so this was from December, this is a Gallup poll, so pretty reliable polling. It's really hard to do polling during wartime when there's 10 million refugees, and so you there's a lot of technical problems with knowing what your sample looks like and all those kinds of things, but Gallup is pretty good. And so these numbers you should take with a little bit of a grain of salt, but they're not bad probably. You see that the vast majority of Ukrainians still want to keep fighting, whatever happens. They want to keep fighting till victory. It's down since last year. Notably, it's down not because more Ukrainians want to negotiate a settlement, not really. Those numbers are more or less once you take into account the margin for error and all of that, they're about the same. But more people don't really know what they want to do because it's not clear what's going to happen. It used to be about a year ago, if you'd ask Ukrainians, how long do you think the war is going to last? When do you think victory will come? They would say next month. Now they say next year. And next year, just means not soon, really. So there is this sort of sense of determination to keep fighting. And when I was in Kyiv, I can't tell you how clear it was that everybody there's no negotiating under these circumstances. Russia has taken a huge part of our territory. They've made it, for us to be an independent, economically viable country, almost impossible by taking that whole Black Sea coast, meaning that they've got their foot on our neck all the time. And any time they want to put us under pressure, they just squeeze. So we need to take that territory back. There's no doubt about it. So they're going to keep fighting. The question is, are we going to keep supporting them? And I think that's really, really important. This just illustrates that the further away you are from war, the more confident you are of winning. The people in the West and the North tend to be more supportive of keeping fighting, whereas people in the East of the country are less. The front line is right along here. So that's sort of, it makes a lot of sense, I think. Oops. I lost my slideshow. Sorry about that. This is the current situation of the war as of yesterday. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because you'll see, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's these green dots all the way along the front line, all the way down through Donetsk, all the way across this region is called Zaporizhia, to a region called Kherson. This green dots mean there's been significant heavy fighting in the last 24 hours. Right? all across the big swathe of that front. This is a war that you don't see much about in the media anymore. You don't see much about casualties. You don't see much about bombing, but it happens every single night. And the fighting is very, very, very intense. How many people have died on the Ukrainian side, we do not know. Zelensky came out with a number yesterday that was about a tenth of what the Western governments had thought. So there's obviously a lot of disinformation and propaganda around that, so we really don't know the answer. But we do know that this is vicious trench warfare that goes on every single day. And this is trench warfare. When you hear that expression, you probably think about the First World War, and it's very much like that. But it's like a First World War with drones. So I can see everything you're doing on your side, and you can see everything that I'm doing on my side, which makes it even harder for either of us to kind of change the course of the battle. Right? We're sort of stuck. And what Ukraine needs and what Ukraine is going to have in order to break out of this is more advanced technologies and longer range artillery. The Russians currently are literally outgunning the Ukrainians 10-1 in terms of the number of artillery shells they fire every day, 10 times more than the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian soldiers often have only 20 or 30 bullets with them for their daily ration. This is in a context in which this fighting is incredibly active and ongoing. They're just running out of equipment. And once they run out of equipment, it's going to be over, and the Russians will win, right? So what can you do about that? Well, the most important thing you could do is call your congressman. This is Greg Murphy. He is the representative in Congress for Goldsboro. Give him a call. He'll be delighted to hear from you. Tell him you care. Tell him you want to make sure that him and his colleagues find a way to get a vote to the floor on the Ukraine appropriations. There is a majority for support for the appropriation for Ukraine in both the Senate, where it's already passed, and in the House of Representatives. But we have to get a bill to the floor. And so please call Greg Murphy and tell him he needs to find a way to get a bill to the floor. There are 7 Republican congressmen in North Carolina, and they should all be, I'll just quote Tom Tillis, our senator, one of our senators, the other day, who, having voted for Ukraine aid in the Senate, made the point that history will remember who you vote for, whether you pick Putin or democracy in this moment. And that's the choice that our Congress people face. And so it would be really marvelous if you could call them and remind them that that's the job. The other thing I wanted to draw your attention is Ukraine is still short of all sorts of medical equipment, medical supplies, tourniquets. I was talking with an American soldier on Saturday who is part of the leadership of the International Legion. So these are international soldiers from all over the world who have volunteered to fight for Ukraine. This is a retired US Marine. And he told me that his soldiers go out every day with 3 or 4 tourniquets, and they use them every day. And then they need more the next day. And so it's basic supplies like that. But Razom for Ukraine, Razom is the Ukrainian word for together. It's a really, really great organization. It's been existed for more than a decade. It's very transparent and public with how they do their accounting. They will use your money in a productive way. So I think with that, I'm going to pause and take your questions. Thank you for your attention and for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Robertson. If you do have a question, just raise your hand. I'll come along with the microphone if you'll just give me a minute to get there. Yes, way over there, of course. See what happens when you retire, right? Yeah. Put you to work.
It seems like initially that our government was very slow in providing munitions to Ukraine. And how did they eventually get munitions all the millions and billions of dollars that went initially, and why can it not happen now the same way it happened before? 'Cause I don't think it was ever Congress that approved the money initially, was it?
So there were initial budgetary, so Congress controls the budget and makes the allocations. The president can't spend any money without Congress approving it, essentially. And so there were very large initial bills that passed, $100 million here, $100 billion, there for Ukraine support. Most of that money actually goes to American companies, because what they're doing, they're not sending piles of cash over to Ukraine. What they're doing is sending American-made equipment. And so they're buying weapons, they're buying tanks, they're buying artillery pieces initially from their own supplies, but obviously they're restocking. And so much of that money stays in the United States. They were slow at first, I think, because they were afraid of Russia. And they were afraid that they would either provoke Russia into widening the war by standing up too much for Ukraine, or that, at least initially, that Russia would reach for a nuclear escalation and use nuclear weapons. What became really clear, really quite early on in the war, was that Russia was bluffing. And the threat to use nuclear weapons, which Putin talked about a lot in the early days, didn't make any sense, because it was like, what are you going to use nuclear weapons to do? How's this going to strategically improve your situation? You use a nuclear weapon, and then what? The Ukrainians are going to stop fighting? They can't stop fighting. They've got nowhere to go. They'll continue to fight, and what will happen is you'll lose support from China. You might lose support from India. You'll become even more of an international pariah, and so you'll be back further behind than you were at the beginning. And I think that became apparent really within the first 6 months of the war, and that's when the Biden administration started to ramp up its aid for Ukraine.
Just a couple of questions, and I'll let someone else. How, it seems that the stalemate right now is between the Congress not wanting to not secure the border, and they're wanting to ensure that the border gets secured, and at the same time, I think they're willing to fund Ukraine, but they're looking for the president for leadership. It appears to me that it seems like now he's starting to say that, well, maybe I can really stop what's happening at the border. And it seems to me that the Republicans have been asking that for a long time now. And it seems that they want that to happen before they're willing to give money for some other country, when we're not willing to spend the money in our own country to defend our own border at this time. And the bill that they passed in the Senate was not a secure the border. It was an immigration policy to continue to allow the flow of immigrants in from all over the world. And it seems that the Republicans would like to stop it, as opposed to just continue the migration that's continuing in perhaps a more organized fashion.
Yeah, so my perspective on that is that these are two different issues. They're both issues of American national security. It matters to us what happens on the southern border, but it also matters enormously that Russia doesn't win this war in Ukraine and put our whole strategic security in jeopardy in Europe. And we end up in an open conflict with Russia. We need to push the Russians back and show them that we're serious about our commitments in Western Europe. And we can do both of those things. But to hold one of them up hostage to another one doesn't make any sense. It's like, I'm going to fix my windows, but not my roof, when they're both leaking, right? And so they have to sort it out, right? But these are they're entirely unrelated issues, and to connect the two of them is to use the Ukrainian situation for political leverage. And I understand that that's what politicians do, right? But what they're doing is they're risking the lives of 30 million Ukrainians in order to make a political point about the border. And I just think that's inappropriate. It's not right for American security.
Dr. Robertson, before we take another question, I'm going to ask Stephen, I think it'll help you see just a little bit better if we take the house lights up just a bit, Stephen. I know those spots are right in your eyes, and there we go. Is that better?
Yeah. it is
Better?
actually. Yeah, thank you.
About a year ago, we were talking a lot about aircraft.
Right.
And now we don't hear anything about those F-16s that they were promising. What happened?
So essentially, we are not prepared to send the F-16s to Ukraine. That was a decision that the Biden administration took, and essentially, I think that they considered that to be a provocation that the Russians would really object to. The other thing is we haven't sent them. We didn't send them for a very long time. Artillery that could fire more than 50 miles, because we didn't want them using U.S. artillery to attack targets within Russia. And I'm pretty sure that's the same logic with the F-16s. Now, they've got some from the Poles, and they got some from the Europeans. But so far, they've not really been a significant factor. When I was in Kyiv in the fall, there were air raids every single night. And the air raid siren would go off sometime between around 12 and 2 a.m. And it's Ukraine, so there's an app for everything. And so you get out your phone, you hear the voice of Luke Skywalker telling you that to get out of bed, and your what did they say? Your overconfidence is your enemy, right? So you get out of bed and you go, and then you go down to the bomb shelter, and you can track on the app where the missiles are coming from. And the Russians have pretty much control of the airspace, except for the fact that the one thing we did provide that was as a total game changer is the Patriot missiles. And so the Ukrainians are able, they don't shoot down the airplanes, but they're able to shoot down the missiles as they come in, and they're able to shoot down the drones. And they've been incredibly successful at doing that. So most nights there are attacks. Most nights, most of the missiles get shot down. Not all of them, some of them land. Then the other thing is when you shoot down a drone or a missile, then you have a fireball that lands somewhere, and that quite often, sadly, lands. These are quite densely populated cities, so they land in someone's apartment or in their home, and that causes death. But the airspace really has been dominated by the Ukrainian part of the air war is purely defensive still.
I think we have another question here, Dr. Robertson.
I'm interested in knowing what you're seeing happening to NATO as this war goes on, and as it seems like the United States is kind of faltering a little, and what kind of implication that may have for NATO.
Yeah, that's a really great question. NATO is one of these things where Putin's efforts to undermine NATO by attacking Ukraine really blew up in his face. Because what really happened is NATO is stronger now than it's been in a really, really long time. And the Europeans really stood up and understood that their security depended on NATO. They're also starting to understand that they might not be able to depend on the United States forever. The kind of the post-World War II balance of security doesn't look as secure as it once was. So America's word in Europe is not as powerful or as reliable as it once was. And so the Europeans have started to increase their own military spending, which is something the U.S. has been wanting to happen for a long time, right? So from the U.S. perspective, this is actually a good thing, that they're upping their military spending. Most of the countries are now at the 2% that they were supposed to spend. But the Europeans are also increasingly thinking about how do we reorganize within NATO to be able to secure our own defense, even if the Americans decide that it's not a priority anymore. And so they're working on these sort of regional forces, so forces that will coordinate between, for example, the Czechs and the Romanians and that southern part of Europe, cooperating with the Poles, in that cooperation in the Baltic states, and much more integration of their own forces there. And so NATO is becoming this kind of, has a lot of little regional blocks now, increasingly within it. And that's probably going to continue to happen, I think, over time. So NATO is very much alive and well for now, but it's also planning for the future.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Metter, do you have a question? Excuse me.
You mentioned American troops. Do we actually have men helping in this battle? I mean, have we sent troops to Ukraine?
So no is the official answer. There are American volunteers. So the American soldier that I was talking to on Saturday is a volunteer, a retired military officer, and there's quite a lot of volunteers out there. I also I quite often teach officers, majors mostly, from U.S. Special Forces come to Chapel Hill to take some of my classes. And I know that after the first invasion in 2014, the guys that I was teaching went to Ukraine. And when I asked how many of you guys are there, they said, I can't tell you, but way more than you think. And I think that's the situation. We provide a lot of technical assistance, a lot of teaching. The U.S. provides it, the Brits provide it, the Dutch. There's lots and lots. It's kind of, so functionally speaking, I've heard generals say that Ukraine is kind of already in NATO from a kind of practical perspective. They're fighting with our weapons, and they're being trained by NATO soldiers on how to use NATO-issue weapons. But there really are there's no American soldiers in combat roles. That's only volunteers.
Do you mind if we take a couple more questions?
Sure,
Is that
no,
okay?
absolutely. I can talk about this stuff all night.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Robertson, you hosted a talk for our students a few weeks ago, and we had 33 students attend, and they were very interested in what you had to say. Great. For them, this is a new topic, and we know with recent interviews with Vladimir Putin, they don't know his history. So I was wondering if you were speaking directly to young people today, when he says things like, you don't really want to get involved over here, what kind of answer would you give them?
That's a wonderful question. Unfortunately, I've known Vladimir Putin's work for a long time. I've been working in Russia since, well, the first time I went there was 1993. What has happened in that period of time is that Putin came to power in 2000, and Russia became more and more repressive over time. It became the freedom of speech, freedom to think, freedom to gather information, became more and more restricted in Russia. And the whole orientation of the country went from being a place that was trying to integrate with the world into being a place where they treated the world as an enemy. And Vladimir Putin has driven that process dramatically. He's been a really, he's not the only person that matters, of course. Russia's a big country, it's got a big state. But he has been at the head of this turn in Russia from wanting to embrace the future to being a country who wants to go back to the past and wants to isolate itself from progress. And as a result of that, Russia has become much more of a problem for the future of kids today than it ever was. Russia at one time was potentially a partner. It wasn't a security threat, and it was engaged in at least thinking about dealing with some of the international crises that we have going on with things like climate change and whatnot. And now it's become a very serious obstacle. That's one thing. The other thing is that I've learned about Vladimir Putin is that his ability to lie, his ability to manipulate media, and his desire to manipulate the conversations that we have here in the United States is really, really strong. And every time you listen to Putin speak or you see him, you have to remember this is a KGB officer. He's trying to sell you something. He's trying to make you think something. Everything he says and does is part of an influence operation. So you never get anything, you never get a straight answer out of Vladimir Putin. And so when you hear him give his side of the story, this is stuff that he wants you to think for his own purposes. And so you have to be very, very careful about taking at face value what a KGB colonel tells you.
Hey, let's take one more. Yes, right here.
Yeah, that's a super question. I do so much research on that. That's really what I think about, all day long. I was telling Max I have a survey in the field in Russia that this morning we were working on over the weekend, and it's out. People are answering it away in their homes in Russia right now. It's actually pretty easy still to do research in Russia, oddly enough. I mean, you put surveys out, either phone surveys or online surveys, or even door-to-door, face-to-face surveys. People are about as willing to talk to you now as they were 10 years ago. And so the data that you get back is pretty reliable. And so we have a pretty good picture, I think, of what most Russians are thinking. And the long and the short of it, I think, is that Russians are very patriotic people. And they are very committed to the idea of their state. They're very committed to the idea of Russia having an important role in the world. And they're very committed to the idea that Russia does good in the world. When Russia acts, it does good. Right? This is very much similar to how Americans think, right, about themselves. Too, they're patriotic. They think that the U.S. should have a voice in the world, and that in general, the U.S. is usually a force for good. And yet, what they're doing is very different. And what their government is doing in their name, rather, is very different. But they tend to be very supportive of whoever is in charge. This is a war. For them, this is a war. And you can't be against your own country in a war. They'll tell you, 70% of Russians tell you they support the war. If you ask them why the war is happening, less than 50% can give you a reason. But that doesn't matter, right? What matters is Russia is fighting. And so Russia has to win. And so it's this fairly simple, I think, quite comprehensible, quite natural to many of us, sense of identity that they have. And that Putin might not be the best and he might not be the greatest, but he's our guy. This war might not be, we ask questions all the time. To what extent do you agree that the war in Ukraine is costly, but the other paths are more costly? People agree with that in massive numbers. So they see this war that they don't really understand why, but Putin tells them it's essential, so it must be. Again, it's an influence operation. It's a manipulation of information. But I think really this is actually quite depressing from my perspective. If you look at Putin's popularity over the last 24 years that he's been in power, his popularity rating has only 1 month in April of 2020 did it fall below 60% when it fell to 59. So it's been over 60% for 24 years. And the economy's gone up, the economy's gone down, they've fought wars, they've lost wars, there's been corruption scandals, people have been murdered, all of these things have happened. And the president's popularity and the trust that the Russian people have in him seems pretty much unmoved by any of that stuff. And I find that very worrying, because I think that sort of knee-jerk blind patriotism is what's really means this. It's going to be very unlikely for this war to really turn unpopular in Russia. You see all the time, you'll hear about on NPR or in the newspapers, they'll say, the Russians are turning against the war. I don't see any evidence of that at all whatsoever. I saw a BBC correspondent a couple of days ago on the radio talking about how the Russians were turning against the war based on a conversation they had had with some guy in Moscow on the street. It's just there's no evidence for that at all. The Russians are as behind this war as they ever have been, and that's pretty substantial support.
Let's give Dr. Robertson one more round of applause. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And don't forget that next Monday night, we're right back here in the auditorium for Terry Williams and the Queen Anne's Revenge. See you next week.